We're going to start the class out on, we're going to be talking about prophecy, foundational truths about prophecy to start with. And we're going to look at a question in your workbooks. It's question number 118, which is based on the book The Foundations. And we're going to look at some things in there that are prophetic. If you understand these things, you have a foundation to understand just about everything else, prophetically speaking, in current events and future situations. So, but you guys can start turning to in your Bibles, Isaiah 5, and we're going to look at verses 3 through 7 to start with. And to start with, the question is, what does a fig tree represent? What does that fig tree mentioned in the Bible represent?
Represent the nation of Israel, right?
Okay, that's one opinion. And any other opinions out there real quick? Okay, we're going to address that right now in this question because this is foundational. This is very important to understand. You might not realize it, but it'll affect, if you're into prophecy, your whole perspective as well as sometimes many decisions you're going to make. And it's most, what's that?
This temple or the temple.
That is actually, as we will see, what the fig tree actually does represent is the temple in Israel. Well, people assume the fig tree represents, and have assumed that for a long time. They assume that, and it's very popular, and you'll talk to Jewish and Gentile pastors as well that's into prophecy, and they generally assume that the fig tree is the nation of Israel. We're going to get into that to prove that that is not only false, but that actually does represent something entirely different, or not entirely, but completely different in perspective of timing regarding it is the temple. And to start with, as we turn there and see this, but the fig tree represents a temple, and the vineyard in which the fig tree is planted, that represents Israel. So Israel is a vineyard, and in that vineyard there's a fig tree, a temple. Just like the nation Israel is a real nation, and it became a nation in 1948. And what happened, and if you don't understand these things and believe the things that have been previously taught and believed that the fig tree was the nation of Israel, then, for instance, like I heard and believed in 1987, when we bought our house, was paying off our house, and it was very popular then that the fig tree represented the nation Israel, which became a nation in 1948, and it was also popular that a generation was 40 years. We're going to look at both those things in the next couple of classes. And the 40-year time span from 48, when they became a nation, is 1988. And this is 1987, and I thought, and I talked to God, well, if you're coming back in 1988, now no man knows the day or the hour, but we do, according to the Bible, know the season. Well, you misinterpret the season, then you're going to be planting corn in winter. It's just not the right season. There's things that are not right about that, and it's not going to work very well, and in the end, you're going to be disappointed, which is what happened. But in 1987, before everybody was disappointed in 1988, when Jesus didn't come back then, and it was very popular, it was all over Christian TV about 1988, and they had all the scriptures that made sense, except for they misinterpreted these things with those scriptures. We're going to get into some of those scriptures in a little bit. But the fact is, God told me they got a couple things wrong. Because I said, why not just, give money to the church for revivals and whatever, instead of paying off our house? And God told me in 1987, they got a couple things wrong, very important things that we're going to get into. So in 1987, God showed me in the Bible what the fig tree actually represents. It's very clear then. And He showed me indisputably what a prophetic generation is. It's indisputable if you believe the Bible. And we're going to get into those things, like I say. And so I did continue to pay off the house and paid it off, my wife and I, in 10 years. And enjoyed having a debt-free house for many years now, since 1997. But nevertheless, let's read Isaiah 5, 3 through 7. We'll see Israel in the Bible, in the Old Testament and New Testament, is referred to as the vineyard, not the fig tree. So let's go ahead and read that. Isaiah 5, 3 through 7. Anybody? We're actually short on time. We're started a little late, so let's move right on through this. We have a lot to cover.
Now you people of Jerusalem and Judah, you judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard that I have not already done? When I expected sweet grapes, why did my vineyard give me bitter grapes? Now let me tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will tear down its edges and let it be destroyed. I will break down its walls and let the animals trample it. I will make it a wild place where vines are not pruned and the ground is not hoed, a place overgrown with briars and thorns. I will command the clouds to drop no rain on it. The nation of Israel is the vineyard of the Lord of
There's
heaven.
plainly said it right there, what he's talking about.
The nation of Israel is the vineyard of the Lord of heaven's armies. The people of Judah are his pleasant garden, and he expected a crop of justice, but instead he found oppression. He expected to find righteousness, but instead he heard cries of violence.
Okay, so this is exactly what did happen to Israel after it was a world power under David and Solomon. It became nothing. And that's why it was reestablished in 1948, because there was nothing there, basically. Some tent dwellers or whatever, but like it said there, it was no longer a nation for a long time. And let's look at Matthew 21. Matthew 21. So Israel is the vineyard, not the fig tree. The vineyard is much bigger than a tree. That's a combination of stuff planted in the vineyard. So Matthew 21, 33 through 40. Once again, this is supporting in the New Testament, Israel is the vineyard, not the fig tree. And you don't want to use, crossover interpretations. When you're consistent, you'll see truth. When you're inconsistent, you're going to be led astray, generally speaking, on things that are important sometimes.
Say it again, Matthew.
Matthew 21, verses 33 through 40.
They say unto him, Lord, that our eyes may be opened. So Jesus had compassion on them and touched their eyes. And
Is that Matthew 21?
Oh, excuse me, yeah, Matthew 21,
Verses 33 through 40?
33, 20, excuse me, here.
33.
33.
Oh, 33.
33 through 40.
33. Matthew 21, 33 through 40, excuse me.
That's all right. Sometimes I do write down a wrong reference. I've caught myself with that. I think it's rare now. I think I've caught them all, and I'm very self-examining on those things, but that makes it confusing when you say, how's this fit the subject?
This is Matthew
21, verses 33 through 40.
30. Here another parable. There was a certain householder which planted a vineyard and hedged it around about and digged its white winepress in it and built a tower and let it out to husband and went far into a far country. And when the time of the fruit drew near, he sent his servants to the husbandman that they might receive the fruits of it. And the husbandman took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. Again, he sent other servants more than the first, and they did unto them likewise. But last of all, he sent unto them his son, saying, they will reverence my son. But when the husbandmen saw the son, they said among themselves, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and let us seize on his inheritance. And they caught him and cast him out of the vineyard, and slew him. When the Lord therefore of the vineyard cometh, what will he do unto these husbandmen?
So Jesus is telling a parable, and he does tell some parables. This one's about a vineyard. It's the Israel nation again, and it talks about the people sent to him, including Jesus, God's son, who was crucified right outside of the city there, just as this parable that he spoke about happened right outside the vineyard. And so the vineyard indisputably can be applied and is applied to Israel. Now let's take a look at Luke 13, 6 through 9. Well, before that, let's look at Matthew 21. We're right there, Matthew 21. Let's back up a few verses 12 through 20. I don't know if we really have the time to read all these. We went over these a couple weeks in class, so maybe we'll just give the references on this. We did actually say that. You can go into detail on that. But Matthew 21, 12 through 20 shows that when Jesus came in on his last week, that he was going to be crucified, his Passover week, And we've seen that he cleansed the temple. This would have been the second time he cleansed the temple. He cleansed the temple at the beginning of his ministry, and he cleansed the temple again right here in this last week when he entered town, right after Palm Sunday. And he went in, cleansed the temple. Then he went out and stayed in Bethany, as you can read here for yourselves. And then he went back in to Jerusalem. It's a short walk, a couple hours. You can easily walk it. And back into Jerusalem, and he's seen a fig tree and cursed the fig tree. And everybody remembers that and wonders, was he hungry? Was he mad? You know, whatever. It's a demonstration. It's a parable fulfilled that we're going to get into. Cursing that fig tree is a symbol. It's an object lesson. He was showing his disciples regarding the fig tree being the temple, and he's going back to cleanse it again for the third time. This is 2 times during Passover week that he cleanses the temple, and between those 2 times, as you can see here, one of them, he cleanses or curses the fig tree. They're all connected. Like we said, a sandwich. You know, you got the 2 outsides, you got the inner meat. So, and it's also found in Mark 11, 12 through 17. And in light of time, we're not going to read those. You can read those on your own. We discussed those 2 weeks ago, I believe it was. And it actually points it out there in 1, how he cursed the fig tree after cleansing the temple in Matthew. And then in Mark, he cursed the fig tree before he went in and cleansed the temple. So obviously, there's 2 cleansings, and there's 1 fig tree in the middle. Those are the references for that. But he told a parable that he was actually demonstrating at that time. And we're going to read that in light of time. We're going to, because there's several verses in the previous things. You can see that on your own. And we went over that previously. But to get more accomplished today, let's look at Luke 13. And we're going to look at verses 6 through 9.
I can read it.
You can read it. First one up, read it because we could cover more that way.
He also spoke this parable. A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it and found none. Then he said to the keeper of his vineyard, "Look, for 3 years I have come seeking fruit on this fig tree and find none. Cut it down. Why does it use up the ground?" But he answered and said to him, "Sir, let it alone this year also, until I dig around it and fertilize it. And if it bears fruit, well, but if not, after that you can cut it down."
Okay, so this is a parable Jesus spoke, a very enlightening parable if you really want to know what the vineyard is and the fig tree. He uses them both right here. The fig tree is inside the vineyard. There's, the nation is not inside the temple. The temple is inside the nation. The fig tree is inside the vineyard. And that's what he's focused on here is the fig tree. It's fruitlessness. Just like when he went to curse the fig tree between the 2 temple cleansing, he was looking for fruit and found nothing. Just like in this parable that he told previously to that event. And so basically, we have a fruitless fig tree here. It has leaves, but it doesn't have the fruit. As we've seen, and Jesus said, you become a den of thieves instead of a house of prayer. Hey, glad to have you. Glad you made it. God bless you. And we're at the fig tree right now talking about that.
Excellent.
Question number, whatever it is, 118 or something. What is it? 18? Okay. Now, to understand this parable, he said he came 3 times, right? And then the 4th time, he said that this time would be up. But the 3rd time, he was thinking you're on probation. And see, Jesus came to the temple 4 times during his 3.5-year ministry. And we can see that. Sometimes it's hard to see that without a little illustration. But there was, in this parable, he's mentioned 4 times. 3 times is on probation, and the 4th time they're going to take it out, uproot it, because it's not bearing fruit. Why take up the ground? And we can see that, we know that Jesus cleansed the temple right after his ministry beginning, at the beginning of his ministry, after he was baptized. 6 months later, it was Passover, and he went in and cleansed the temple, and that was the first time that he went to the fig tree. Then the 2nd time was at the end of his ministry, the 1st year. This is the 1st year. 1 at the beginning, 1 at the ending. The 2nd year, at the ending again, he went to the temple for Passover. And the 3rd year, which would be 3.5 years after he was baptized, he came in, and that's Palm Sunday. This is the 4th time. You see that? 4 times he come to the fig tree, and this time the fig tree's time is up. Then he cursed the fig tree between the 2 temple cleansing. So this parable is dead on to exactly what Jesus was doing. It's 4 visits, 4 times, and it's gone. And that's exactly what happened. He cursed the fig tree, and it's a symbol of the temple, and immediately the fig tree showed signs of death. I think it's dropped its leaves. And all the disciples took note. So, wow, look at that. And then we see the next day when they come by, Peter notes, this fig tree, look at how fast it's being disintegrated. And on that day, the next day, it was like a twig, all dried up and turned into dust. So it was miraculously being removed. And the same thing happened to the temple, basically. It had 2 signs of death. At Jesus' crucifixion, when he died, the temple, as we talked about last week, was ripped open. The curtain to the Holy of Holies, revealing that there was not even an Ark of the Covenant in there. And we discussed all that last week. But the bottom line is, it was tore open, showing the sign is shook, and then it was ripped open from the Holy of Holies, showing that the temple, and many in the Talmud, or whatever you pronounce that, the Jewish writings of the priests of the time, said that there was just a very few miracles that continued to happen until that time. After that, nothing happened that was miraculous unless it was ominous. And then in 70 AD, the temple was ripped down from, as Jesus said, not one stone was left upon another. Then it was completely removed, leveled. So it had 2 signs of death and removal spiritually, removal physically, and the same as the fig tree. So let's go ahead and take a look at Matthew 21:19. I'm going to focus a couple things at this time when he cleansed the temple and was focusing on this. Instead of reading the whole passage, we are going to focus on a couple key parts. And the first one to it, go ahead and read it. Matthew 21:19.
And when he saw a fig tree in the way, he came to it and found nothing thereon, but leaves only, and said unto it, Let no fruit grow on thee henceforth forever. And presently the fig tree withered away.
So right in front of them, it was withering away. It was dying, and because there was no fruit. And let's look at the next verse, Matthew 21:20.
And when the disciples saw it, they marveled, saying, How soon is the fig tree withered away?
So it's like right in front of their eyes. It's like, wow. So this is a miraculous demonstration of removing the fig tree that he had referred to in the temple, in a parable, which referred to the removing of the temple. So if the fig tree is the temple, we're going to skip down a little bit. Is there any questions about that to start with? It's pretty clear there. There's actually, you can focus on Mark 11:20 through 21, Luke 21, 29 through 32, Matthew 24, 32 through 33. And these last ones talk about Jesus referring to this fig tree again. Let's take a look at, first of all, Luke 21, 29 through 32. And this is during the same week. And they're at the temple, leaving the temple at this point, after the fig tree had been cursed, and they're talking about the glories of the temple. And Mark, I'm looking at Luke. Are we looking at Luke, chapter 21? Looking at some questions. Luke 21, 29 through 32. These are why the fig tree is important prophetically. Jesus spoke about these things. And so during this week, as I recall the order, I actually started putting everything in exact orders so I could understand all the Gospels together at that day, that week. And but nevertheless, it was during that week. It's 21 through 29 through 33, 32. Luke 21. Go ahead.
He told them this parable. Look at the fig tree and all the trees. When they sprout leaves, you can see for yourself and know that summer is near. Even so, when you see these things happen, you know that the kingdom of God is near. I tell you the truth. This generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word will never pass away. Okay,
so he's talking, he opens up with, look at the fig tree and all the trees. So here he's not focused on just the fig tree as a symbol of the Jewish religion, because Judaism is centered in the temple and temple sacrifices by the priests. But he's saying all the trees. So it's a prophetic statement that all the religions, the fig tree represents a religion, it's the Jewish religion, the temple, and all the other religions will be back at the end times. So it's going to be a very spiritual time before he comes back, but there's a lot of pagan religions that have come back. That's the other trees. And so actually we can look at a more narrow focus on the fig tree. Let's look at Matthew 24, verses 32 through 34. And you notice at the end there, it says, this generation won't pass until these things are fulfilled. That's a key statement. Because the disciples are talking, this is a prophetic chapter, Matthew 24, and this is in that prophetic chapter, verses 32 through 33. And he says, behold, look at the fig tree. Focus, it's a sign. It's a sign of the times. And it's what times? It's the times of the last generation. The last generation of the world? No. The last generation before he comes back. So let's go ahead and take a look at these three verses or so. 32.
Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at least at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place.
Okay, so that's talking again about a prophetic statement. This is all prophetic stuff. Fig tree is not here yet, right? So the temple's not here. The fig tree is not here. We can't look at it yet, right? He's talking about looking at the fig tree. He's talking about looking at something that's not here yet. That's prophetic. And he's talking about this generation that sees these things. That's prophetic. That's a prophetic generation. Very key stuff that we're going to look at. Let's look at one more thing in Mark 13, 28 through 30. The key is that that's the last generation before he comes back. And you got to wonder, if you put these together, are we in the last generation according to the Bible? Are we? No. This is not the last. We're not in the last generation right now. We're not seeing the fig tree. That's a key. And so that bases all the current events that we're looking at. Are they part of the last generation events? No. They're building blocks. They're building a stage for future events. Jesus is not going to come back this week. Otherwise, he would violate his own word and many prophecies that are yet to be fulfilled. Go ahead and Mark 13, 28 through 30. Go ahead and read that, anybody.
How long the parable of a fig tree, when her branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves, ye know that summer is near. So ye like manner be still see these things come to pass, know that it is near, even at the doors. Verily I say unto you that this generation shall not pass till all these things be done.
So this is Mark. We've seen it in Luke. We've seen it in Matthew. It's recorded in 3 of the 4 Gospels. That signifies this is important for God to know these things, so we can know what season we're in. Very important to know that, to make decisions for the future. And so that is the key. Is there any questions that the fig tree, what's it represent?
Temple.
The temple. Pretty undisputable, I think. The vineyard, what's it represent? Israel. So when Israel became a nation in 1948, there we start having a vineyard. After we have a vineyard, pretty soon, someday, we're going to see a fig tree there. It's a prophetic statement that there will be a prophetic temple. And it's going to be seen, and it's going to be lively, and we'll be able to observe it. And that generation that does that is considered the last generation according to these verses in 3 of the Gospels. So let's go to the next question. If there's any questions on that yet, that's foundational. If you keep that in mind and keep everything basically consistent with that, you'll see perspective different when you're talking about current events and you hear people saying, we're at the end of the world. We're not at the end of the world, not even close. So, but we are changing times. Could be the end of the world for our country. You know, there's decisions to be made, predict how we actually are able to survive or not survive or live or kind of society we're going to have in the future. But there are revivals coming. So there's predicted revivals by Jesus himself. So things are not always going to get worse. Someday things are going to be a lot better before he comes back. It's a revival that's predicted. It's never happened. It's a great awakening. Not just a revival. They say there's revivals going on now, and there are. But there's a great awakening. That's a mega revival. That's society changing stuff when you have a great awakening. And it leaves an impact. And it's going to be a great awakening of truth in the Bible. We're not going to, as a church, not going to be led astray by what day Jesus died. Obviously, it's Preparation Day, if you know anything about previous teachings, on Wednesday. We are soon going to be celebrating his death, and you'll see that most of the church misbelieve that it was Friday, which doesn't add up to 3 days and 3 nights. Those kind of things are going to be history. And they're going to look back and say, how did they ever believe that? So plain in the Bible, just like some of these things. How did they ever think, just like in 1910, they thought Jesus was coming back? It was Halley's Comet. So plain in the Bible. We weren't in the last generation yet. So anyhow, these things are important to know, and there's good times coming. They're on God's calendar. Our kids could experience that great awakening. So it's not necessarily all darker. Sometimes darkest before the dawn. So let's go ahead and look at the next question real quick. 119 says, in the Bible, fill in the blank. In the Bible, 40 years is often a what number? It's the number they use for a generation. It says it's 40 years after 48. And this is also important to know if you really want to see perspective.
Transitional?
It is a transitional number in the Bible. When you see 40, it's often referred to as, now you can get extreme in some numbers. You don't want to go carried away with every number. It actually means this only and that's it. But the fact is, it often refers to a transitional time. We see that as a transitional, and go ahead, you can turn here, Genesis 7:12. While you're turning to Genesis 7:12, when Jesus died, it was 30 AD. I can prove that in the book if you want to read it. Some people think it's 33. That's incorrect. It's proven in the book what year it was. It was 30 AD. And bottom line is that 30 AD is when he died, and the temple was cursed. It was basically ripped open. The Holy of Holies, the fig tree was cursed. A curse is God removing his blessing. Whenever God removes his blessing, what's left? The devil. What's the devil do? He makes your life miserable. That's a curse. So if God removes the light, you will see darkness. And that's what happened. So bottom line is that the temple was cleansed and ripped open. Jesus died in 30 AD. And 70 AD, it was cleansed. Leveled. Trying to get ahead of myself. I do wrong when I actually try to rush, and I shouldn't do that anyways, because things come out wrong, or distorted, or confusing. But between 30 and 70 is 40 years. Point being, there's a transitional time of removing the temple. It was 40 years. We can see that in history. Let's look at Genesis 7:12.
And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
That's it. So 40 days, there's 40 again, and 40 nights, 4 again, 40. And it was transitioning from a very violent people to a very peaceful time when Noah and his family was going to repopulate the earth. So that was a transition again. 40 days and 40 nights of flood made the difference between before that and after that. And for that society, it's before the flood, after the flood. Let's take a look at another thing in Mark 1:13.
In what?
Mark. No, we're going to go to Mark now. That was Genesis. We're going to look at Mark 1:13. We'll look at a couple examples to say it's just not my thinking or assumptions that 40 is transitional. You cannot say 40 is the number of the last generation. We're going to prove that that won't work. But right now we're going to look at what 40 does represent. It does represent something. It's a transition.
And he was there in the wilderness 40 days, tempted of Satan, and was with the wild beasts, and the angels ministered unto him.
So there he is, Jesus transitioning from being a carpenter's son to being a rabbi. 40 days in the wilderness. Once again, you got that 40 number again. And there they are in the wilderness. He is in the wilderness being tempted of the devil. And he comes out of that and starts choosing his disciples. There's 40 again as a transitional number. And so he just received the Holy Spirit right at the beginning of the 40 days. It was transitioning that when he was baptized as the beginning of the 40 days. And then 40 days later he come out of the wilderness. Let's look at Numbers. Book of Numbers in the Old Testament. Numbers 32:13.
And the Lord's anger was hindered against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years. until all generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was consumed.
Here's that number again. That's where they get the generational number, because that generation had died in the wilderness. Well, that's a people. There's a lot of ways to use generation as in the book, and you can have a 4-generational picture with a great-grandson to a great-grandfather, or you can have generations used in different forms. This was a generation that was dying off so that their kids would take their place, basically, because there was a generation of slaves that came out of Egypt. And so they was transitioning during this 40-year time. It says 40 years, and everybody is referred to 40 years in the wilderness, and that's an accurate number according to the Bible. There was a couple years getting the promised land, and then they come back, but the totality of their time in the wilderness was 40 years, from leaving Egypt as slaves to when they entered the promised land under Joshua and started taking their promised land. So that was a 40-year period of time of transitioning from being slaves to being citizens of their own country. So that was another transitional time. Is there any question that 40 represents a transition? A transitional number, transitional time. There's 4 examples right there, and there are a few others. Let's go ahead and go to the next question then. Question 120 is, a prophetic generation's time frame is how many years? Is it 40 years to start with? No, we just seen that doesn't work. That's not what it means. 40 is not a time of a generation. It's not a measure of a generation. It's a measure of a transitional time. So 120 years is the accurate number. It's a number given in the Bible, and we'll look at that in Genesis 6:3. And that is the only number that'll work. There are other popular numbers that people use besides 40 for a generation, they think prophetically speaking. Some of them are 70, because the Bible refers to a man's days will be years, 70 years, I believe, in Proverbs somewhere. And then there's always 100, which is a number that people think, and it's actually used in one place. And we're going to discuss how that is applied, this 100 years that is mentioned at one point. It can be a little confusing, but it can't be 100 and fit the totality of what the Bible has to say about a generation, prophetically speaking. 100 falls short, and we'll see that. But to start with, where does this number even come from? Is it made up from somebody? No, God gave us this number at a transitional time, at a time when he says a man's days will be. A will be is a prophetic statement. They are not now, but they will be. And it's a gauge, a number that God has put out there and we can use, and we see that it's the only number that does actually apply prophetically to how long a generation is, which hasn't started yet. So the point is, when that generation starts, they have a 120-year time span before the end of that generation. So during that time, could be at the beginning, could be in the middle, towards the end, usually not at the beginning according to God's pattern. But the bottom line is, so this is why this is important to understand if you really want to understand where we are prophetically. So let's read this. Genesis, where did you get this number? Genesis 6:3.
My spirit will not put up with humans for such a long time, for they are only mortal flesh, and the future of their normal lifespan will be no more than 120 years.
So there's the number, and every translation puts that number the same, 120 years. It's a number we can use, biblically speaking, talking about a man's days. So let's take a look at Genesis, how we can actually guarantee that that's significant, that means anything. And Genesis 15:16. Let's take a look.
Question.
Go ahead.
We're right there in Genesis 6:3.
Yes.
We read, and it says Genesis 7:11, in the 600th year of Noah's life. So like 120 people don't live to be 120 now; they're lucky to live 100. But it says Noah lived over 600 years.
That's a good point to make. And the fact is, everybody before the flood lived hundreds of years.
Yeah.
That was normal. Noah was not necessarily a really old guy at 600 years old. His dad, Methuselah, lived to be 900 and some years old. That was his dad, who died the day of the flood. So that was because they had a better environment to start with. Because we went into this in past classes, they had a vapor shield that was water, better than our ozone shield, so they didn't have deteriorations from radiation. They also ate better, was better as far as their original creation, closer to that when it was created perfectly to last way long. Actually, technically, they could have lasted forever in their human bodies had they not sinned. And God had to take the tree of, we won't even get into the tree of life because that was removed, so that they couldn't take of that. It's in heaven now, so that they wouldn't still live forever in their corrupted state. So anyhow, that's for future classes on prophetic things. But bottom line is that, they used to live much longer, and that's why this statement is significant at the time of Noah. Even though Noah is 600 years, he says man's days will be 120 years old on average. That's the generation. That doesn't mean we all are guaranteed 120 years. Many of us, nobody hardly lives that long today because of all the pollutions we have and what we eat and all kinds of things. But the bottom line is that was a number that wasn't common at that time. He wasn't given a significant number of man's days will be 700 years, 600 years like Noah was, or whatever. It was 120. That's a short time in their perspective. And it's a time we can use, which now in our perspective is a long time. So that's where that all fits together, but it is significant, as we'll see right here in Genesis 15:16. So let's go ahead and take a look at that.
But in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Key statement, fourth generation. They shall, they are not, they're not even born yet. This is Abraham, cutting a covenant with God. He's childless right now. Even Ishmael has not been born to him. This is when he's 75 years old. And as you'll see in the book, he went into the promised land at 75. This is still during that first year, as I put out in the book and illustrate how there's a mirror image of when Isaac was born to this first year that he was in the promised land. And this first year, towards the end of the year, he cut the covenant with God. And God says to him, in the fourth generation, your children will be in the promised land. And so that's a key statement. God's word is true. And to believe anything of these other numbers, you'll see, don't fit. And the only one number that fits, the fourth generation. That's why I have these 4 lines up here. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to put down, this is the first generation, ends at 120. The second generation ends at, they're 120-year spans. Add 120 to 120, you got 240, right? And then add that, and you got what, 360? And then you add that, and you got 480, right?
Right.
So, can we see that in there? Probably not. So we're focusing on years 360 and 480. This is the fourth generation. 1, 2, 3, 4, right here. It starts at 360, and it starts at the covenant. From the statement. Here's the statement. It says, in 4 generations. From the statement promised Abraham 1, 2, 3, 4 during this time frame, not after it, but in that generation, 120-year generations, your children will be in the promised land. Prophetic statement of how long a generation is. This proves indisputably it's not 100 years or less, because it would already be expired before that fourth generation started on a 120-year basis. And we know that not because I put it up there, because we can read it. Let's look at Exodus 12, 40 through 41. Exodus 12. Let's read this in the King James Version, because most of the translations mistranslate part of this. We don't want to get into how that misleads people into thinking that they were in Egypt all this time as slaves or anything else. We will get into that shortly to prove the facts that the King James actually illustrates here. Well, the King James, there's no contradictions when you read this verse. But let's read Exodus 12, 40 and 41. Key number that they all use, no matter what translation you have.
Now the sojourning of the children of Israel, who dwelt in Egypt, was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day, it came to pass that all the host of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt.
So this is 430 years later. From what? The covenant, obviously, in my opinion, there's no disputing it. It's 430, right? Is that in the fourth generation?
Yes.
It's towards the end, but it's in the fourth generation. So we have a number of years left, and it comes out, and it says in the New Testament to back that up, that there's 430 years between the covenant with Abraham and Moses giving the law, which is on Mount Sinai, which happened shortly after they left Egypt. They're at Mount Sinai. It's still the same year, 430-year period there. Talked about in Galatians. That's why we know that's the number. If there are 430 years between Abraham and Moses, we know they weren't in Egypt 430 years. They're actually in Egypt half that time, and half of that time they were slaves. And we'll get into that in the later questions here as it comes up, just to clarify these things and put them all in perspective. So we know that they were coming out of Egypt. It was year 430, so 400 years would have expired by the time they came out. And so let's go ahead and figure out, we know how long they actually wandered in the wilderness, right? How long was that?
40 years.
40 years. So did they go into the promised land in 430? No. Actually, it was 2 years in the process of getting there with the Mount Sinai experience and other stops along the way. So basically, roughly 2 years later, they're at the promised land, and God tells them to go in. What happens? Did they go in? No. Could they went in?
Yes.
Yes. It was their choice. It's God's sovereign design for them to go in during this generation. But we have choices. God's plan is big enough to fit our choices, whether we participate with God or not. His plan is big enough. It won't change his plan. His grand plan is right there. It's going to happen. But we have choices whether we participate or don't. They chose not to participate of their own free will. That's why we have our own free will. We're not pre-programmed to go to heaven and hell or anything else. We make choices, and those choices have consequences. Their consequence was that they would be turned around and go back into the wilderness and wander another 38 years, a total of 40 years altogether. So they didn't go in. They all died off except for Joshua and Caleb. There were two of the spies that went in and said, we have a good report. We can do it. We see the multiple fruit, and we see the tall giants and everything else. But with God's help, we can do it. Well, God says, I honor your request in spite of everybody around you being wrong and rebelling against God's word to go in. We're going to honor that. And those two went in. And Joshua actually led the troop into Israel 38 years later under Moses' transition to authority from Moses to Joshua, and crossed miraculously the Jordan, which dried up to the town of Adam, which is unique, that town. But anyways, bottom line is that they went in later, 40 years later. So 40 years later, we add that to what, 430, right?
Right.
So you add the 430, you add the 40. What is your number that they went into the promised land?
470.
470. This is simple math. It's simple adding. It's all in the Bible. And it's clear and it's undisputable when you get down to it. And the numbers are all there. They went in at year 470. How many years did they have left before the end of the fourth generation? 10 years left. Now, even if you want to add the 2 years and say they wandered for 40 years, and they've still got 8 years left. Any way you look at it, God gives you the numbers right there. So he shows indisputably that a prophetic generation, and fourth generation, here's prophetic generations, is 120 years. No other number works. So when that fig tree does happen, and that generation sees them, how many years can that generation last, prophetically speaking? Huh?
10 years?
No, that's the number they have left. We're talking about how long is it with the fig tree shows up. Let's say the fig tree shows up next year. And it declares, according to Jesus, this is a sign to look at. This is the end generation. This is the last generation that sees the fig tree will see him coming back. So when the fig tree comes back,
120.
what?
120.
There's a 120-year generational span there. We just seen it. So he says this generation, prophetic statement. He says this generation, prophetic statement. This fourth generation will be in the promised land. Did it happen? Yes, it did happen. And it was their choice to go in under that time frame. They had choices earlier than that. But that's what that basically fits perfectly, and there's nothing else that fits. And the Bible fits like a quilt. like a pattern, all different cross-threading. They all come together to express truth across the board. And that's the truth. There's no getting around it. There's no other number. When that generation starts, it hasn't started yet, there's a 120-year span. Does that mean that God's not coming back after it starts for 120 years? No, that doesn't mean that. What it means that he could have a plenty of time to progress whatever is undone yet, whether it's revivals or whatever, after that starts, after the fig tree gets here, after the temple gets here. He's got as far as 120 years. He's never come back to the last minute, and he's never come back at the first second of any situation. But he tends to wait till things mature, and as they mature, then it tends to be as it is here, towards the end of that time frame, they ended up having the opportunities, but God was looking at them. Did you have a revival yet? Are you listening to my words yet? No. Maybe your kids will listen. And maybe I got to wait till the next generation for this great awakening, because nobody's paying attention to his word. Nobody trusts his word. Nobody believes his word. Nobody's listening to understand what he's saying. And so sometimes a whole generation has to pass as far as their kids. That's not a prophetic statement. That's a kids, grandkids statement. Generations use multiple ways. Go ahead and question.
Who will be in the fourth generation?
In this case, it was the kids the people of Israel that came out of Egypt. They were all part of that fourth generation here. But they tended to have a different mentality. They were slaves for most of their life, if not all their life. Technically, I think 120 years, 70 years. They were slaves for basically most of their life, or a lot of their life. And so bottom line is that they were the ones that come out. Moses was one of them. He was born under slavery. And so slaves came out and they had a slave mentality. But their kids were born, many of them born in the wilderness. And so they had a different outlook. As often, the next generation has a different perspective, and they learn from their parents. You know what? Our parents made a lot of mistakes. Let's not do that again. Let's not let history always repeat itself like that. Let's learn something from that history. And they did learn from that history. They wasn't going to rebel against God next time. He said, let's go in the wilderness, go in the promised land. Let's not wander longer in the wilderness. So that's the generation that went in, was the kids of the slaves predominantly, except for Caleb and Joshua. So those are the ones that actually did go in. They fulfilled the promise. And so that's how that works. I don't have time to get into next week. We're going to get into the question. It's in Genesis during that same time of Genesis 15:13. And there's a confusing little thing there about 400-year time frame. Obviously, when he's talking about this 400 years, he says, your descendants. So it's not starting, that starting date didn't start at the covenant. This starts later with Abraham's descendants. There becomes a time frame of 400 years. And it actually predicts the year that Moses will be called to deliver Israel. It's a 400-year time frame. We're going to get into that to finish this question up next week, because we're over time. We're out of time. And so let's go ahead and close in prayer. Thanks for joining us.